This is a story my dad shared with me, dating back about 35 years. I'm going to recount it from his perspective, just as he told it to me. Growing up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, camping was a frequent pastime for my friends and me. It was a way for us to hang out, have a few drinks, and enjoy the freedom that comes with being young and carefree. When I was about 18, my friends and I made a spontaneous decision to spend a weekend camping near a lake called Small Fry. Although it wasn't too far from Portland, it felt remote enough to be an escape. The plan was last minute, so we only brought some blankets and a case of beer that my older brother had picked up for us. After school on Friday, we set off. Once we arrived, we found a clearing where we could park the car. We started off by building a small fire and cracking open a few beers, but it didn't take long for us to get bored. We decided to go for a midnight swim. The spot where we parked wasn't directly on the path to the lake, but it was only about half a mile away, and we were confident in our sense of direction. The four of us, already a little tipsy, set off into the woods, certain that we knew where we were going. This was back in the 80s, long before we had the convenience of cell phones with maps to guide us. About 15 minutes into our trek, the atmosphere around us suddenly shifted. It had been a warm night, the kind where the temperature lingers around 70 degrees. But as we walked, the air grew noticeably colder. Out of nowhere, I felt a chill run through me, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. Without a word, the four of us simultaneously turned on our heels and bolted back towards the campsite. It was as if some primal instinct had taken over. I've never run so fast in my life, driven by the fear of being the slowest, the one left behind. My only thought was survival. I didn't want to die that night. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't now, but there was a sense of something malevolent behind us. Not a person, but a presence that meant us harm. We raced back to the car, unlocked it in a frenzy, and sped away, leaving everything behind: the fire, our clothes, and the blankets. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, too shaken to speak. When we got back to my house, my friends quickly got into their own cars and left. None of us ever spoke about that night again. A few weeks later, summer had officially begun, and my family went on our annual camping trip with some close family friends. One evening, as about 20 of us sat around the campfire, sharing stories and chatting about life, someone from one of the other families brought up a strange experience they'd had while hiking. He described how he and his wife, along with some friends, had gone hiking one Saturday. They were surprised to find the trail completely deserted, even though it was a popular spot and usually busy on weekends. As they hiked to the top of a cliff overlooking a lake, he said that an eerie silence fell over them. The group felt an overwhelming urge to leave, abandoning their plans to take pictures or even enjoy the view. They hurried back down the trail, moving much faster than usual, none of them speaking a word. They just knew they had to get out of there. The man said that once they were safely back at the car, they all drove home in silence, and none of them had spoken about it since. Curious, I asked where this hike had taken place, though I didn't mention my own experience. When he said it was at Small Fry Lake, a cold dread washed over me. It was the same lake where my friends and I had felt that inexplicable terror. I didn't say anything to my parents, not wanting to worry them or have them forbid me from camping there again. This may not be the scariest story, but I can't shake the feeling that something is deeply wrong with that place. After hearing the man describe how he felt his life flash before his eyes, I realized we'd both experienced the same inexplicable fear. I've never believed in the supernatural, but after that night, I'm convinced it's the only explanation. Whatever it is that haunts that lake, I know one thing for certain: I'll never go back there. I spent my childhood in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved there when I was just 6 months old. Originally, I was born in a small town called Mount Clemens, which happens to be the birthplace of Dean Cain from the Adventures of Lois and Clark. That's probably the most notable thing about my birthplace. Michigan is quite an interesting state, positioned as it is on the northern edge of the US and the southern edge of Canada. Most people born in Michigan tend to stay here, and it's rare for anyone to visit the remote areas like where I grew up. Our region is mostly isolated, surrounded by the Great Lakes, and apart from a few large cities, the state is covered in dense forests. Growing up in the Upper Peninsula was an experience filled with quiet isolation. We lived on top of a hill, with the nearest town a 30-minute drive away and the closest neighbors a good 10 miles off. It was a place where few cars ever ventured. The sound of a vehicle climbing up the hill always sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like you could hear them coming from miles away, and since there were no through roads, any vehicle passing by had to be there for a reason. Our roads didn't even have proper names, they were just identified by numbers. As I got older, I became more accustomed to the occasional car during the day, recognizing the vehicles that belonged to our distant neighbors. But nighttime was different. When darkness fell, the sight of headlights cutting through my bedroom window filled me with an inexplicable dread. The light painted eerie patterns on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no one had any reason to be driving down our remote road after dark. I was 13 at the time, and it was 1996. Our family had just gotten the internet, which, for anyone in their mid to late 30s now, knows how revolutionary that felt back then. Around that time, my dad installed a sliding glass door near the computer area. The computer was the heart of our home back then, unlike today where everyone has their own devices. The view of the countryside from the computer desk was nice, at least for the first 2 days. It was a Saturday night, and as usual, I was up late on the computer, probably messing around in Yahoo chat rooms or playing Myst. Then I felt it, a low rumble, like the growl of an approaching truck engine. The sound grew closer, creeping down the main road. The truck passed our house and then came to a sudden stop. That old fear, long forgotten, surged back like a tidal wave. Nothing good could come from a truck stopping on our road at 1 in the morning. What happened next is etched in my memory, as vivid now as it was then. The truck screeched to a halt, and the passenger door flew open. A man jumped out, quickly circling to the driver's side. Though it was too far to see clearly, I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He wore a puffy vest, jeans, and a trucker cap. The larger man grabbed the driver and slammed him against the tailgate, shouting something and gesturing for him to open it. The driver hesitated, visibly shaken, before finally complying. The passenger thrust a shovel into the driver's hands and pointed to a spot on the roadside behind the truck. The driver, trembling, began to dig. He shoveled frantically for a few minutes before stopping and exchanging words with the passenger that I couldn't make out. Then, the larger man pulled something out of the truck bed, a closed sleeping bag, with a shape inside it. He dragged it over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men hastily covered the hole, their attempt sloppy and rushed, before speeding off. You might be wondering if I went out to see what they had buried. Of course I did, and that's the most unsettling part of this story. When I checked the spot the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I'd seen. The tire tracks were still there, but whatever had been thrown into that grave was gone. What terrified me even more were the footprints leading from the burial site into the forest. I was left in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. I've buried this memory deep, trying to convince myself it never happened. Apart from a few close friends, I've never spoken of it, but I believe that someone was inside that bag, and the men who buried it thought that person was dead. But based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You can chalk it up to a teenager's overactive imagination if you want, but I know what I saw. There are things in this world that defy explanation, and even if you could explain them, the truth might be something you'd rather not know. My father once owned a small house for a short period. He didn't live there, He bought it with the intention of renovating it and selling it for a profit. This house was secluded, nestled on a dead-end street deep in the woods. The location was very private, but the road had a reputation for being a dumping ground for stolen cars and other unsavory activities. There were only 2 houses on the entire street, and the neighbor mentioned that the house had previously been used as a drug den. A few months after my dad bought the place, he asked if I could meet him there to help unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did and noticed a car parked in front of the house. Curious, I walked over to check if anyone was inside. The car had license plates, and there were clothes piled up in the back seat. As I circled the vehicle, a growing sense of unease washed over me, as if I wasn't alone. Then, I heard someone moving in the woods near the house. I stood at the edge of the woods for a while, just watching and waiting. A few minutes later, my dad arrived with his trailer. He got out of his truck and approached the car. I told him I had a feeling that the owner of the car was still nearby and mentioned the noises I'd heard coming from the woods. He glanced over at the car, just as I had, and we both decided to explore the woods to see if we could find anyone. As we walked, the unsettling feeling of being watched intensified. I even joked with my dad about how creepy it would be if we stumbled upon a dead body. He admitted that he shared the same eerie feeling, that we weren't alone. The path we followed eventually led to a dead end, so we turned back. When we returned to the house, the car was still there. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned vehicle. After hanging up with the police, we went inside the house to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes, but when we came back out, the car was gone. Someone had been watching us the entire time, waiting for the right moment to drive away. The police never showed up that night, and eventually, we left. Weeks later, a dead body was discovered in the forest near the house. A woman who was hiking in the area found it, but she had heard about it from a neighbor beforehand. This neighbor had a reputation for being an unstable drunk, so no one took him seriously at first. After the body was found, the police finally came out to investigate. A detective took a statement from my dad, but he seemed oddly disinterested. I can't shake the feeling that the parked car we saw that day was connected to the body that was later found. My dad mentioned that, as far as he knew, the police never followed up with the neighbor after the body was discovered. He spoke with the neighbor months later, just before he sold the house. The story took an even stranger turn when the hiker who found the corpse mentioned that it looked relatively fresh, not like a decayed heap that had been there for years. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. Yet, the police later claimed that the body had been there for a long time. Something about that doesn't sit right with me. If the body had been there for years, it should have been reduced to bones and rot. It just doesn't add up. I can't help but wonder what might have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of that car that day. Two years ago, an unsettling experience still haunts me. My husband, our 2-year-old daughter, and I had just moved to Tennessee, hoping for a fresh start. Exhausted after a long drive, we were eager to settle in. My parents, who already lived in Tennessee, were helping us unload the truck. As expected, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out to greet us. That's when we first encountered Ben. The moment I laid eyes on him, I felt uneasy. Even our daughter, who is usually overly friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly recoiled. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but our focus remained on unpacking rather than getting to know our new neighbors. Later, my dad mentioned that he had caught Ben staring at our daughter. When confronted, Ben denied it, but my husband wasn't having any of it and told him off. That night, as we continued unpacking, our daughter spent the night at my parents' house. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Assuming it was the pizza I had ordered, my husband opened the door. But instead of the delivery guy, there stood Ben. He asked if we needed any help, which felt incredibly odd given the late hour. Before we could tell him to leave, he demanded a cigarette. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him that, he became agitated, shouting at my husband and pounding on the wall. This guy was completely unhinged. Fortunately, our landlord lived nearby and came out to intervene. As Ben sauntered away, the landlord explained that Ben had mental health issues but was generally harmless as long as he took his medication. Not exactly reassuring on our first night in a new place. Despite the rocky start, we eventually settled into our new home. Our schedules were hectic, often requiring us to work late into the night. I would come home around midnight and frequently spot Ben loitering outside the apartment buildings, always watching me. I tried to ignore him, too exhausted to care, but his constant requests for cigarettes became increasingly annoying. My husband mentioned that Ben did the same to him. We started altering our work schedules to avoid him, which worked for a while, but Ben soon began harassing us during the day. On our days off, we would take our daughter to the park or explore the mountains. On one occasion, Ben asked to join us, insisting that he was good with kids and that we could trust him with our daughter. I should have let my husband punch him right then and there. When we returned, Ben was sitting in our parking spot, claiming he was saving it for us. He then tried to hug our daughter, causing her to scream and cling to me in terror. I hurried inside with her while my husband finally lost his temper and told Ben to leave us alone. We reported the incident to the landlord, but they dismissed it as just another symptom of Ben's mental issues. I understand that mental illness is difficult, but this man was frightening our daughter, and our priority was to protect our family. It reached a point where our daughter was too scared to go outside because the bad man might be there, watching her. We threatened to break our lease if nothing was done. Talking to our neighbors, I discovered that they had similar experiences. One neighbor even told me that he and another neighbor had caught Ben ogling young girls in bathing suits by the community pool and had chased him off. They reported it to the landlord, but, as usual, nothing was done. After about a month, things seemed to calm down. Ben wasn't seen outside anymore, and we assumed he had moved away. We were considering moving in with my parents while saving up for a house. One night, I came home early from work. My husband was out of town, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit relatives. I decided to unwind by playing Saints Row 4 after a grueling 11-hour shift. I was deeply engrossed in the game when I heard a knock at the door. It was around 10 p.m., and anyone coming over that late would have called or texted first. As I approached the doorknob began to shake violently, and I heard Ben's voice, screaming for me to open the door. The knocking escalated to him slamming his shoulder against the door, yelling like a madman. I grabbed my phone and the sharpest knife from the kitchen, then hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but I needed some distance between us if he broke in. I called 911, and they told me that other neighbors had already reported the commotion. It wasn't until I heard sirens and voices outside that I felt safe enough to come out. I opened the door to see a cop pinning Ben to the ground, while the landlord was yelling at the cop to let him go. Both Ben and the landlord were arrested. I gave my statement, and my neighbors corroborated everything, even adding their own encounters with Ben. My sweet, church-going neighbor called my husband and parents to inform them of the situation, and she let me stay with her family for the night. But after what had happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept expecting to hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding again. It turned out that Ben was a registered sex offender, and rumor had it that the landlord knew but chose to overlook it because Ben's family paid him extra to let Ben stay. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. It makes me sick to think about it. Ben was indeed on medication, but he had stopped taking it for months. He tried to convince the cops that our daughter was his and that we had kidnapped her, and even claimed I was having an affair with him. Insane, right? Last I heard, Ben was sent to an institution, though I'm not sure if it was a prison or a psychiatric facility. The landlord was fired and practically run out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months of free rent for our trouble, but that was the final straw for us. We sold most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we now have a house, and our daughter is no longer afraid to go outside. And yes, we thoroughly checked our new neighborhood for any red dots on the map. When my mother was 14 years old, back in 1986, she lived in China with her parents and younger brother. It was the dead of winter, and the temperature had plummeted below zero, with snow piling up thickly on the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mom finished her classes, and by then, darkness had already settled in. In China, it's common for young students to walk home alone, so she didn't think much of it as she made her way back after getting off the bus. About 10 minutes into her walk, she entered an old marketplace that she had to pass through to reach her apartment. The marketplace was eerily silent and deserted at that hour, with no streetlights to illuminate the path, making it hard for her to see clearly. However, she was familiar with the route, having walked it many times before. As she walked, my mom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was lurking in the shadows. She tried to brush it off, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The only sound she could hear was the crunch of her own footsteps on the snow, until suddenly, she realized there was a second set of footsteps echoing behind her. Panic set in, but she kept moving forward, pretending she hadn't noticed anything, convincing herself that it could just be another student heading home. Despite this, her pace quickened, and the footsteps behind her seemed to do the same. The fear was overwhelming, and she broke into a run, but the thick snow made it hard to move quickly. Glancing back, she saw the shadowy figure of a tall man just a few meters behind her. What struck her as strange was that, despite the bitter cold, the man didn't appear to be wearing a coat. The lack of light made it difficult to see any other details, but that wasn't what frightened her the most. The chase continued until she reached an area dimly lit by a light attached to a merchant stall. In that faint glow, she could see that the man was carrying a large plank in his hand. Terrified, she pushed herself to keep running, refusing to look back again. Finally, she spotted the light from a lamppost on a small street ahead. By sheer luck, a young couple was walking in her direction. With the last bit of energy she had, my mom sprinted towards them and collapsed at their feet, sobbing uncontrollably. When they asked her what was wrong, she told them what had happened, but by then, the man had disappeared. The couple, who happened to live in the same apartment block as my mom, recognized her and were acquainted with her father. They escorted her home and informed my grandfather about what had happened. After that night, my mom couldn't stop crying, overwhelmed by shock and fear. From that point on, my grandfather would always meet her at the bus stop and walk her home. My mom never discovered who that man was, and thankfully, she never encountered him again. In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family just before my brother was about to start middle school that August. My parents were in their bedroom watching TV, while I was busy working on some school assignments. In the next room, my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game, kindly keeping the volume low so I could focus on my essay. Around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered I needed to fill up my car with gas. I quickly finished the last paragraph of my essay and called out to my parents, letting them know I'd be out for a short while but would come right back. The gas station was only about 10 minutes away, so I expected to return in around 20 minutes. I grabbed my keys, gave my boyfriend a quick kiss goodbye, and left without another word. After about 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I began fueling my car, I noticed an old, beat-up pickup truck out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw two shadowy figures inside, just sitting there. I couldn't make out any specific details, but it looked like they were talking and checking out the area. I dismissed it and continued to fill up my tank. Before getting back into my car, I decided to run into the store to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I quickly selected a few items, And just as I was finishing my purchase, two men wearing jeans and black hoodies burst into the store, guns drawn. They both looked to be in their mid-20s and were fairly muscular. "Everybody get on the ground," one of them shouted, and the cashier and everyone else in the store immediately complied. There were a few panicked whispers until one of the men barked at them to shut up. My heart raced, and I felt a cold chill run through me. These men were about to rob the place, and I feared they might start shooting. I silently prayed that no one would be killed or seriously hurt. One of the men grabbed my hair, yanking me to my feet. "Stand up," he commanded, terrified for my life. I obeyed without hesitation. Almost instantly, I felt an arm wrap around my wrist, gripping tightly. I wanted to fight back, elbow him, stomp his foot, or punch him in the face, but fear had me frozen, unable to think or act. The worst part was feeling the cold barrel of a gun pressing against the back of my head. I tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip and hissed, "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man yelled at the cashier, "Hand over the cash, or you'll be scraping this girl's brains off the wall." I had no connection to the cashier, aside from being a customer in the store, but I could see in his eyes that he wanted to protect me. He was an older man, likely in his 60s, wearing glasses. I knew he had no choice but to comply with their demands. As he hurriedly unlocked the register and handed over the money, I felt the gun press harder against my head. I fought to stay calm, but tears welled up in my eyes, my throat burning from holding back sobs. All I wanted was to stay alive. Once every dollar was in the robber's hands, sirens suddenly blared from outside. The man stuffed the cash into a backpack, then punched the cashier before throwing me aside. I hit the edge of the counter with my stomach and arm before collapsing to the floor. Within seconds, the two men ran outside, only to be immediately surrounded by police. They were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still trying to catch my breath, but my concern was more for the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. He seemed okay for the most part, though I noticed his right eye was starting to swell and bruise, and his glasses lay broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I asked weakly. "My stomach's hurting, and I can't see too well right now, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the officers, a good friend of my father's, had entered the store. "Just the two of us might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us and immediately recognized me. He asked if I was okay, and the cashier and I recounted everything that had happened. As other officers came in to question the remaining customers, we learned that someone had managed to sneak into the bathroom and call 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning was over, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst into tears, not from the pain, but from the sheer terror of what I had just experienced. I just wanted to go home and put an ice pack on my aching stomach. The cashier was taken away on a stretcher, and an officer asked if I needed medical attention. I shook my head, crying, "I just want to go home." As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few officers inspecting the truck I had seen earlier. It dawned on me that the vehicle belonged to the two men. They had been scoping out the place, waiting for the right moment to strike. I realized I had probably been the first person they saw, and they used me as bait. A police car followed me home that night. As soon as we arrived in my neighborhood, my mom rushed out of the house and hugged me tightly. She kept asking what had happened, but I could barely speak through my sobs. Once inside, my boyfriend saw me and immediately wrapped me in his arms, holding me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained the situation at the gas station. After the cops left, I lay on the couch with an ice pack on my stomach, watching TV. My brother came in and asked what had happened, but I knew he had to go to bed soon, so I promised to tell him in the morning. I was still shaken by the whole ordeal and didn't want to scare him. That night, I made a promise to myself: I would never go to certain places at night again. A few years back, my neighborhood was shaken by reports of a woman being brutally attacked. This was particularly alarming because we had recently managed to drive out a group of drug dealers who had been operating in the area, and with them, most of the gang-related violence had ceased. We had all been looking forward to a period of peace, but that hope was quickly dashed. I lived in an apartment building, and at the time, I was around 17 years old. The attack on the woman was horrific. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten into unconsciousness. Over the following months, at least a dozen more women were attacked in a similar fashion. The details were sparse, as it seemed the victims were too terrified to speak out publicly about what had happened to them. Thankfully, all of them survived, but none could provide a clear description of the assailant. He would typically ambush his victims from behind in the darkness, targeting women on their way home from work. It became apparent that he was stalking these women, learning their routines before he struck. The entire community was on edge. You could sense the fear everywhere. Husbands and fathers would rush their families indoors as soon as the sun began to set. Children weren't allowed to play outside after dark, and since it was winter, the nights came early. The streets were eerily empty as soon as dusk fell. One evening, my grandmother came to visit us. My mother was bedridden with the flu, so my grandmother stayed with us for the day. We got caught up in conversation, and before we knew it, night had fallen. It didn't feel right to let my grandmother walk to the bus stop alone, especially with a serial rapist on the loose. My mother, feeling too ill to accompany her, left it to me, the foolishly brave teenager, to take on the task. Standing at only 5'2", I wasn't much of a bodyguard, but I couldn't bear the thought of my grandmother walking those dangerous streets by herself. We made it to the bus stop without incident, and I waved goodbye as her bus pulled away. A small crowd of people had just gotten off the bus, and as they dispersed, I suddenly had the unnerving sensation that I was being watched. I spun around, and there, standing under a lamppost just down the street, was a shadowy figure. My heart stopped. The recent attacks were fresh in my mind, and now here I was, practically alone, staring at a menacing silhouette under a streetlight. Without a second thought, I broke into a run, catching up with the group of people who had just gotten off the bus. I darted through the crowd and sprinted all the way home, glancing back every few seconds, terrified that I was being followed. By the time I reached my apartment, I was in a state of panic. I know nothing actually happened to me that night, but the fear I felt was overwhelming. I decided to call the non-emergency police line, just to report the suspicious figure I'd seen. It couldn't hurt, right? A short while later, an officer called me back. They were eager for any leads, so they took my report seriously. Using footage from the bus stop security camera, they managed to get a clear image of the man. His appearance was an exact match to the description given by one of the victims. A few days later, I learned from a local news report that they had arrested someone in connection with the attacks. On the night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had nearly killed a female police officer who was patrolling an area where one of the assaults had occurred. He had ambushed her from behind and almost beat her to death with a crowbar. Thankfully, she survived, but the severity of the attack likely intensified the police's determination to catch him. I also found out that the man had been at the bus stop that night, possibly scouting for his next victim. I'm so grateful I trusted my instincts and called the police. I like to think that my actions that night played a small part in the arrest of a very dangerous man. Hopefully, he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars, where monsters like him belong. When I was 9 years old, back in 1987, something happened that I still can't shake. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, right near the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom was employed at the Congregational Church. Every Sunday, without fail, I was dragged along to church with her, even when I didn't want to go. The one thing that made it bearable was knowing I could play on the playground afterward and maybe snag some cake, which was almost always available. One Sunday in late November, after enduring another service, I joined the other kids from class outside in the churchyard. We played, socialized, and, of course, made a mess with the cake. That's when I spotted Abby. She was 2 years younger than me, more popular, and honestly, we barely knew each other. Despite that, I felt this strange, urgent need to talk to her. So I approached her on the playground and said, "Abby, you need to grow your fingernails out. If someone tries to hurt you, you can go for their eyes." I wasn't joking. I felt something deep inside urging me to say this. She looked at me, puzzled, and asked why. But I didn't have an answer. All I could say was, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, Abby, her younger brother, and their mother were found dead. They were murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot their mother, Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother, William. LaPlante managed to evade the police for 2 days before being captured in a town about half an hour away. When he was finally arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. When I found out what had happened, I broke down. The horror of their deaths, coupled with the strange sense of responsibility I felt, was overwhelming. I finally understood why I had been compelled to warn her, but I couldn't explain how I had known. It felt like I had failed her, and the guilt was unbearable. No 9-year-old should have to carry that kind of burden, but I did. It took years to come to terms with what happened. Survivor's guilt is a terrible thing, especially when you're too young to even understand it fully. I still wish I could have done something more to save her. My best friend is a social media influencer, not a huge one, but with enough followers to get some free stuff and a couple of sponsored trips. She has a full-time job but does the Instagram thing on the side mainly for the perks. She isn't big enough to make a living from it yet, though. Her first sponsored trip was in 2018 when a small boutique hotel in Miami contacted her through Instagram. They offered her an all-expenses-paid trip to Miami for Memorial Day weekend in exchange for staying at their hotel, taking photos, and sharing a few stories on her account. She was told she could bring a female friend along, and everything would be covered. Since this was her first time doing something like this, she wasn't fully aware of how it worked. They sent her a contract to sign, but it seemed a bit sketchy. The contract stated that she had to pay for her plane ticket up front, with a promise of reimbursement later. The reasoning was to avoid no-shows, cases where influencers take the ticket purchased by the hotel and then never show up. It seemed reasonable enough, so she invited me instead of a female friend because she was nervous about the whole thing. We figured it wouldn't be a big deal, and worst case, if they refused to cover my ticket, she'd pay for it herself. The day finally arrived, and we landed in Miami. A man holding a sign with her last name and the hotel's logo was waiting for us at the airport. He greeted us and led us to a black SUV. But that's when things started to get strange. As soon as we got in the car, the driver seemed upset. At first, we thought he was talking to the guy who had walked us over, but then we realized he was speaking to my friend. He had a heavy accent, wore dark sunglasses, and kept insisting that my friend wasn't allowed to bring her boyfriend, meaning me. He kept repeating that the hotel was expecting 2 girls, not 1 girl and a guy. He demanded to know where the other girl was. We were stunned and confused. The guy who had walked us to the car looked frustrated and started arguing with the driver in what sounded like Portuguese. Then he turned to us and asked again where the other girl was. At this point, my friend was furious and explained that she was the influencer from Instagram and that I was just a friend joining her on the trip. The man in the passenger seat got out, threw our luggage out of the car, and muttered something like, "This is some bullshit." Then, without another word, they drove off, leaving us standing there in shock. My friend immediately emailed Melissa, the PR person she'd been corresponding with, but got no reply. We decided to take a cab to the hotel. When we arrived, everything started to make sense. The hotel had been rebranded with a completely different name. We showed them the Instagram account, which indeed belonged to the old hotel, but not the new one. They claimed they had never contacted us. Whoever had control of the old Instagram account had set this whole thing up. The account was real, it had over 10,000 followers and was for a well-known hotel, but the posts and pictures were all outdated. My friend was devastated and broke down in tears. We called the police and met with a detective. They tried to investigate who had been running the account or who had access to it, but nothing ever came of it. It's terrifying to think that someone was trying to lure my friend, or other girls, using this old hotel Instagram account. The account has since been deleted, and we never heard from anyone involved again. But the thought that my friend could have been kidnapped if she had brought another girl instead of me still sends chills down my spine. I've never been lucky in love. It seems I have a knack for picking the wrong guys. After 5 years with the father of my child, I finally called it quits. 3 months into single motherhood, I was just beginning to find myself again when my neighbor approached me. He mentioned that his friend, Steve, was interested in meeting me. It didn't take long for Steve to charm his way into my life. The first 6 months were incredible, but soon he began drinking more heavily. Each time, he became increasingly agitated, picking fights with random people and even our mutual friends. Slowly, our circle began to dwindle as everyone learned how Steve became when he drank. Yet, his drinking didn't stop, and the anger that had once been scattered was now entirely directed at me. It took about 6 to 8 months for things to spiral from name-calling and shoving to full-blown violence, punching, choking, the works. The relationship had become a nightmare. I remember one time when I escaped through a bathroom window, only for Steve to track me down by beating up a friend until they revealed my location. When he found me, he ripped off all my clothes in a drunken rage, laughing as he dared me to try escaping again while I was naked. The final night of his abuse was the worst. I told him that my 3-year-old son wasn't feeling well and that I planned to stay with him until he fell asleep. My real plan was to spend the entire night with my son. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard the bedroom door creak open. I pretended to be asleep, holding my breath as tears welled up in my eyes. Suddenly, I felt Steve's hand grab a fistful of my hair, yanking me out of bed. He whispered in my ear, "I know you're avoiding me." He dragged me to the living room, threw me on the floor, and accused me of planning to leave him for another man. Before I could even respond, he furiously concluded, "If I catch you with another man, I'll kill you both." He was more intoxicated than usual that night. After a few punches and kicks that left me sprawled on the floor, I began to crawl toward my son's room. He followed me, taunting, "Where do you think you're going?" He knelt in front of me, his eyes dark with anger, and said, "You stay right there, or I'll hurt you real bad." He then slumped onto the couch, watching me like a predator eyeing its prey. After about 30 minutes, he seemed to pass out. I knew this was my only chance to escape. I threw on an oversized shirt, scooped up my son, and quietly crept past him. But just as I reached the door, he jolted awake, grabbing my leg. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled. My heart pounded as I stammered that I was just going to the kitchen to get my son a drink. He scowled and spat out, "Hurry up." The moment I entered the kitchen, I bolted out the front door, no pants, no shoes, no purse, carrying my son in my arms. We ran all the way to the police station, which, thankfully, was only a few blocks away. After hours, the station operates through an intercom system. I rushed inside, pressed my back against the wall, and hit the button, sliding down into a sitting position as I clutched my son, waiting for Steve to burst through the door any second. All I could think was that if he was going to beat me, at least it would be caught on camera. I heard a voice through the speaker ask, "How can I help you?" But all I could do was cry. I couldn't even form words. Two officers quickly came to my aid. A female officer took my son and got him some food while I went with a male officer to make a report. He gave me a blanket to wrap around myself. 15 minutes later, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath, terrified that he somehow knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, the officer returned with a sergeant. I feared they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my things while Steve was in custody, but instead, they asked more questions about his temper and past incidents. I explained Steve's escalating alcohol problem and the increasing violence. They then showed me a list they had found in Steve's handwriting. It detailed how he planned to dismember my body and where he would bury me so no one would ever find me. He had even marked down possible dates, with some crossed out. I couldn't breathe as I read it, tears streaming down my face. I looked at the officer and asked, "What does this mean?" He replied solemnly, "It means you're lucky." Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I moved back to Arizona before the trial, but I gave a detailed statement before I left. Despite his plea of not guilty, Steve was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Just before I left, I received a letter from him. It simply read, "It's not over. You'll always be mine." When I was 19, I lived in Littleton, a suburb of Denver, sharing a chaotic studio apartment with 4 other people. I worked at a hair salon on the same block, and despite the crowded living conditions, I was hardly ever home, spending most of my time at work. The plaza where the salon was located attracted a mix of people, including a group of homeless drunks who often loitered nearby. One man, in particular, stood out. He always reeked of alcohol and was overly friendly, often flirting in a way that made me, a young 19-year-old, uncomfortable. I don't remember his name, so let's call him Mark. He frequently invited me to drink with him, but I always turned him down, using the excuse that I had a boyfriend. One afternoon, after finishing work around 4 o'clock, I headed to a nearby coffee shop. As I enjoyed my drink outside, I noticed Mark approaching me with a wide grin. He asked for a lighter, and though I was reluctant, I handed it to him. He lit a cigarette and brushed my arm as he returned the lighter, sending a shiver down my spine. I quickly stood up and told him I had to go, refusing his repeated requests to join him for a drink. After that, I didn't see him for a while, which was a relief. One night, I decided to take a walk, something I enjoyed doing, especially during that time of year. I strolled through downtown Littleton and was on my way back to my apartment when I saw a figure up ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I got closer, I realized it was Mark. He was stumbling along the sidewalk, almost falling into the road. My first mistake was not turning around or crossing the street. Instead, I hoped he wouldn't recognize me in his drunken state. But he did. Mark stepped in front of me, flashing that same broad smile. Resigned to my fate, I asked how he was doing, trying to keep the conversation light. He said he was fine but insisted his day would be better if he had someone to drink with. I told him I couldn't, as I had work early the next morning. He ignored my excuses and continued to beg, trying to sway me with his drunken puppy dog eyes. I was starting to feel uneasy, and when I tried to sidestep him, he blocked my path with his arms. I firmly told him to move, but something snapped in him. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, squeezing it tightly. I winced in pain and tried to pull away, but he held on, grabbing my other arm as well. The pain triggered my fight-or-flight response, and I chose both. I shoved Mark as hard as I could into a nearby bush and then took off running, not stopping until I burst through the door of my apartment. I collapsed on the floor, sobbing, as my alarmed roommates gathered around, trying to comfort me and asking what had happened. Once I pulled myself together, I explained what Mark had done. By then, my boyfriend had arrived and was furious. He grabbed a bat and stormed out, determined to find Mark. One of my roommates stayed with me while we waited for his return. When he came back, he said he couldn't find him. We considered calling the police but ultimately decided against it, as we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves, with marijuana still illegal in Colorado at the time. Instead, I bought pepper spray and started carrying a knife, which made me feel safer. I also stopped going for walks after dark unless my boyfriend was with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, and honestly, I was perfectly fine with that. Wherever he went, I hope he stays away because next time, I won't hesitate to defend myself. After much hesitation, I decided to share this story in hopes that it will serve as a warning to others. It's been 6 years since the incident, and even now, as I write, a sense of dread creeps in. I'll be deliberately vague with certain details, as the fear still lingers. I'm a 23-year-old woman, but at the time, I had just turned 17. I was working as a waitress in a restaurant when a new cook, whom I'll call John, was hired. At first, John seemed harmless enough. I've always been kind and avoid confrontation whenever possible, even if someone gives me a reason to be otherwise. The work environment was friendly. We often joked around and played harmless pranks on each other. Eventually, John joined in on these light-hearted antics, but I want to be clear, I never flirted with him or showed any romantic interest. Our interactions were always in a group setting. One evening, after closing, I stepped outside for a smoke, and John was there too. We started chatting, and the conversation shifted to finances and the fines we had to pay. I mentioned a recent speeding ticket that I had no idea how I would pay, given that I was still in high school and working limited hours. A few weeks passed, and though we exchanged small talk, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Then, Valentine's Day arrived. The restaurant was packed, and I was at the register, cashing out a long line of customers. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed John just standing there, staring at me. Assuming he needed to clock out, I told him to give me a moment. When I finished with the last customer, I motioned for him to use the computer. To my surprise, he handed me a large box of chocolates and said, "Happy Valentine's," before clocking out and leaving. I was left standing there, bewildered. Earlier that day, I had complained to a friend about my boyfriend not even getting me a card for the occasion, and now here I was, holding this unexpected gift from John. Did he overhear my conversation and feel sorry for me? Or was there something more to it? I brushed it off, but the answer to that question would soon become clear. After that night, I didn't see John for about a week due to our different shifts. One day, after school, I was doing my hair and makeup in my car before heading into work when I noticed a car pulling up beside mine. I heard someone calling my name and looked over to see John. He seemed excited and told me to come over. Hesitantly, I got out of my car and walked over to his passenger side. He urged me to get in, and like a foolish teenager, I did. My heart raced as I sat there, palms sweating. John pulled out a rose, one of those artificial ones you find at gas stations, and then a wad of cash. It felt like a scene from a movie, with him shoving the money into my hand, saying it was for me. I sat there, stunned, the weight of the cash in my hand feeling almost unbearable. I struggled to find words, wondering what I would have to do in return for this gift. After what felt like an eternity but was only a few seconds, I asked him, "What's this for, John?" He replied, "It's for your speeding ticket. I've been in trouble with the law before, and I don't want to see anything happen to you." My mind raced, and I didn't like where it was going. Finally, my conscience won out. I laid the cash on his dashboard and said, "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept this. It's your money, and I need to handle my own mistakes." With that, I quickly got out of the car and went inside to clock in. That night, everything seemed normal, except for the occasional sad look John gave me. I almost felt sorry for him, thinking maybe he was just lonely and needed a friend. So, we hung out a few times outside of work. Looking back, I realize how naive I was, a 17-year-old girl spending time with a 30-year-old man who gave off increasingly unsettling vibes. He would make subtle passes at me, and I would politely excuse myself. Eventually, I stopped hanging out with him altogether, sending a brief text to let him know I wasn't interested in a relationship. But John wouldn't take no for an answer. He bombarded me with texts and calls, trying to get me to hang out with him. Every time we worked the same shift, he would give me one of those gas station roses. I would cringe and accept it, avoiding confrontation at all costs. Eventually, I asked my boss for shifts that didn't overlap with John's. Soon after I started ignoring his texts, John was fired for not showing up to work. A month or two later, I quit as well. I had switched phone companies and gotten a new number, hoping that would be the end of it. But one night, while I was waiting in the car to pick up my best friend from her boyfriend's house, my phone buzzed with multiple text notifications. To my horror, the messages were from John. He had somehow gotten my new number and was confessing his undying love for me. Bewildered as to why I was ignoring him, I felt sick to my stomach. My best friend, who had just gotten into the car, noticed my distress and took the phone from me, reading the texts aloud. She suggested I call my mom, but I knew my mom would be furious if she found out a grown man was harassing me, so I didn't. Just then, I got a call from another number. I answered, only to hear slow, deep breathing before the line went dead. My friend urged me to block the number, which I did, but the random texts and calls from different numbers continued for weeks. Each time, I blocked the number, but the unsettling breathing on the other end of some calls left me unnerved. Eventually, the calls and texts stopped, and life began to settle down. I moved out of my mom's place, got my own apartment, and started a new life. I changed schools, got a new car, and found a job at a medical facility. My boyfriend, James, moved in with me, and we tried to put the past behind us. One day, while I was doing laundry at my mom's house, she handed me a piece of mail. It was a letter addressed to me, with no postage stamps, just my name written on the envelope. The return address was from the restaurant where I used to work. Curious, I opened it, only to feel a wave of panic wash over me. It was from John. The letter was 2 pages long, filled with disturbing declarations of love, offers of a house, car, and even children. The most chilling part? There were no postage stamps, meaning John had personally delivered it to my mom's mailbox. I was frozen in fear, trying to come up with an excuse to tell my mom as she asked what was wrong. I lied, telling her it was from an old friend informing me of another friend's passing. Somehow, she believed me, and I quickly left the house. On the drive home, I tore the letter into tiny pieces and threw it away, desperately hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I confided in James a week later, and while he was upset that I hadn't told him sooner, he agreed with my fears. He bought me a baseball bat to keep in my car and mace to carry in my purse. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I began to let my guard down. One day, after school, I was driving to work when I noticed a red car following me. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but as I made turns and switched lanes, the car stayed right behind me. When I pulled into my grandfather's driveway, the car pulled in behind me. John got out and started walking toward my car, calling my name. Panic set in as he reached my door and blocked my way to the house. I barely remember what was said, but I do remember feeling trapped. Somehow, I managed to push past him and run inside, where my grandfather and great-uncle confronted John, telling him to leave. For the next few days, my grandfather followed me home, and my coworkers would walk me to my car. James would greet me in the driveway every night, and I did everything I could to stay safe. But the paranoia never left. I deleted my social media, changed my routines, and constantly looked over my shoulder. One day at work, an older coworker informed me that a man had come in asking for me while I was off. He was told I wasn't there, and he left. Later that night, another coworker who resembled me was followed home by a red car. Her mother met her outside with a gun, and the car sped off when they realized she wasn't me. I broke down, apologizing to her over and over, feeling guilty that my nightmare had put someone else in danger. That was the last major incident with John. Years later, I did some research on him but found little more than traffic tickets and a suspended license. I try to keep tabs on him, refusing to be a victim again. While he never physically harmed me, the lengths he went to find me were terrifying. I've since moved again, gotten married, and started a family. But just the other night, after returning home from a long shift, I found one of those artificial roses on my front doorstep. This incident occurred around 4 years ago when I was 19, and it still haunts me. I'm 23 now, but that night is etched in my memory. It was a stormy evening, and the wind was howling outside, easily hitting speeds of 50 miles per hour, while the rain pounded down relentlessly. I was up late, indulging in video games as I usually did on weekends, though the storm had me worried about a possible power outage, something that often happened during such weather. After several hours of gaming, I decided to grab a snack and headed to the kitchen. Living in a mobile home park means the houses are close together, so I wasn't surprised when I heard a series of popping sounds outside. Initially, I dismissed them as thunder, but when the sounds persisted, I became curious. I glanced out the window near the back door, which faced the direction of the noise, but all I could see was the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. Assuming the storm was to blame, I finished my snack, turned off the lights, and returned to my game. About 10 minutes later, I heard what I thought was a noise at the front door. I had a motion-activated light on the porch, so I peeked out my bedroom window to see it glowing. Now, this had my attention. Someone or something had triggered it. Alone in the house, I felt a shiver of unease. I cautiously made my way through the darkened home toward the front door, which had a diamond-shaped window at its center. I crouched down to avoid being seen and slowly raised my head to look out, but there was nothing there. Still, I decided to step outside into the rain-soaked night. Again, I found nothing and quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. As I walked back to my room, I noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a police car through the window. Curious, I went to the back door and saw at least 3 police cars parked on the road. I couldn't quite make out what was happening, but I saw 2 officers speaking with someone who lived in one of the mobile homes nearby. After watching for a bit, I lost interest and returned to my room. The next day, I turned on the news, and what I learned chilled me to the bone. The noises I had heard the night before weren't just the storm, they were gunshots. The police reported that a drug deal had gone horribly wrong. 2 men were executed, one shot in the head, the other multiple times in the chest while sitting in a chair. The incident was believed to be gang-related. One of the victims was identified by a family member, while the other was the owner of the mobile home where the deal had been arranged. After seeing this, I contacted the police, convinced that the man who had just killed those 2 people had tried to enter my home that night. The timing aligned with the sounds I had heard, and the police agreed that the killer might have been looking for a place to hide, mistaking my house for an empty one. When he realized I was inside, he likely fled into the night. I never heard from the police again after giving my statement, and I don't know if the man was ever caught. The thought of what could have happened if he had chosen to break in or if I hadn't been alert enough to hear him still terrifies me. I narrowly escaped becoming his next victim. This experience taught me to always be vigilant. You never know what dangers might be lurking just outside your door.